viewers, and welcome back to my channel. I will come here to a powerful conversation about the complexities of race and identity. Now, if you're new here, then don't forget to subscribe, like, and feel free to share your thoughts on what you think about this video at the end. Now, today we're exploring how the concept of palm-coloredness has evolved over time and how different groups have been perceived and treated within the hierarchy of palm color supremacy. From the Irish experience of indentured servitude to the myth of Irish enslavement, we will take a look into the nuances of oppression and privilege. Now, our speakers will share their insights on how the Irish, despite facing discrimination, were ultimately assimilated into palm-coloredness, while others like Black and Indigenous people remained marginalized. So with that said, join me as we unravel the intricate web of race, class, religion, and xenophobia that has shaped America's history. Let's confront the uncomfortable truths and explore how understanding our past can inform a more equitable future. Check out these interesting videos. I will be right back.
So first, I want to say this is a very interesting comment, and the short answer to your question is, of course, we do not think that white people are indigenous to America. Absolutely no way. In my bachelor's degree, I studied Irish culture, and that includes our long-standing tradition of emigration that is still with us today. So as I said in my previous video,
I think we're too hard on the Irish Americans for saying that they have Irish culture. They do have Irish culture. It's just that that culture is the one we had in the 1840s.
Irish American culture is Irish, but it's the Irish culture that we had in the 1840s. And that involves both the intergenerational trauma of being refugees and being oppressed in Ireland, but also, unfortunately, a shift to white supremacy. I would also like to recommend you a book by Noel Ignatieff, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, called How the Irish Became White. So the way oppression worked in Ireland was, of course, British colonial rule, and that depended on whether you're Catholic or Protestant, if you spoke Irish, if you only spoke Irish, or if you only spoke English, etc., etc. But the way oppression worked in America was quite different. In this book, in the introduction, he says they, as in the Irish, came to a society in which colour was important in determining social position. It was not a pattern they were familiar with, and they bore no responsibility for it. Nevertheless, they adapted to it in short order. Irish American culture isn't just Catholicism and alcoholism, as one not tasteful comment said. Irish American culture is also the product of the oppressed becoming the oppressor as a means of survival, but like cool motive, still racism. This isn't to say that all Irish Americans today are racist, and it isn't to say that the first generation of Irish ancestors you had were racist, because a lot of them did share close quarters and culture with Black people. In the introduction of his book, he also says, in becoming white, they cease to be green. Now listen, racism is still very much a thing in Ireland, but we have a very different relationship to race here, just as every country or society does. In America, things are about colour. Here, it's different. The most oppressed ethnic minority in Ireland are Irish travellers or Minkeri, who, to an American eye, most of them might be seen as white. So I think the whole why don't Europeans claim their descendants thing. I think we can claim that Irish Americans are descendants of a previous Ireland, but these descendants cannot claim to be Irish in the way that it means right now. You are not a product of the current Ireland we live in.
Why were the Irish not considered white when they first immigrated to the United States? It would be inaccurate to say that Irish folks were ever suffering the same indignities and dehumanization as Black or Indigenous folks on that ranking system of white supremacy, but they definitely weren't right at the top with whiteness. And we can see this under the myth of Irish enslavement. Irish folks were never enslaved under chattel slavery the same way that African folks were. Irish people did have to endure forced labor, but it wasn't passed on by a matter of them being Irish. In 1662, there was a law in the Virginia colonies called Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which basically said that if a woman is enslaved and she's an African woman, then her children are automatically enslaved under a condition of being Black. back. What the Irish suffered in the United States was called indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a system of forced labor where the person had a contract and was usually indentured or forced to work without pay in order to repay a debt. So yes, it was slavery, but it wasn't chattel slavery because you could not buy, sell, or trade an indentured servant. You could buy their debts and then have them work for you to repay that debt, but it was totally different than chattel slavery, but it was still messed up. Indentured servitude and chattel slavery were both outlawed in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, except as a punishment for crime, which is a whole other conversation to be had. Both systems were horrible, but there's a little difference in the amount of oppression and the racialized context behind them. So when we say that Irish people were not white, what we're actually saying is that they didn't have the same privileges afforded by white supremacy that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and other white peoples from Europe were afforded. Irish people in the United States faced ethnic, classist, religious, and xenophobic discrimination. That's true. But the way that Irish people were assimilated into whiteness, or finally viewed as accepted into whiteness, is a really interesting history too. It's also a little racist. Race is a construct or a human invention that was created to rank and differentiate and separate people based on our natural human differences. Natural human differences are real, like differences in our skin tone, hair texture, facial features, etc., but that's not what race is. Race is all of the politics and meaning associated and tied to those. As Dr. Dorothy Roberts says, race is a political category that has been disguised as a biological one. When you're categorized by the system that is race, you are racialized, and people have been racialized differently depending on what the politics and society that have been controlling our behavior needed at the time. Starting in around the 1840s, Irish people were subjected to similar racialization and stereotypes that Black people were, saying who was and wasn't desirable, who acted uncivilized, and other things of that nature that are incredibly racist. From the jump in the US, Irish folks were allowed to go to white-only spaces, were allowed to marry and have children with other white people, but the issue here really is that they didn't have the same privileges and rights as other white folks. Irish folks already had an incredible amount of passing privilege, meaning that they would be perceived as white until it was maybe demonstrated that they were Catholic instead of Protestant, or that they started speaking with an accent. An excellent book that talks about all of this is called How the Irish Became White, and I recommend reading it. Ever since 1878, literal US courts have litigated the issue of whether certain groups are white or not. The unfortunate fact about how Irish folks became white in the context of the US is that they started contributing to the oppression of Black Americans. It's kind of difficult to articulate, but essentially, early Irish immigrants started to demonstrate that they could be more harsh and more brutal in their treatment of Black Americans than the people who were already considered white. This happened during chattel slavery, where many Irish immigrants did not own slaves, but became overseers and essentially carried out the will of the slave-owning masters. And then this continued in places like New York and Boston, where Irish immigrants became in control of the police force. By organizing politically and becoming tools of white supremacy, Irish folks were allowed to assimilate into whiteness. Irish American history provides a pretty unique example about how permeable and inconsistent the rules of white supremacy can be. So while today Irish folks are perceived to be white, even that's problematic because not everyone in Ireland is white. A person's perceived or actual connection to whiteness, as well as the extent to which they uphold white supremacy, are all privileged in the system that we exist in, which is white supremacy. Checking and using our privilege, as well as learning our actual history and why we have these categories in the first place, are all phenomenal tactics to start disrupting white supremacy. This is not about being ashamed of your history or trying to rewrite it. It's about knowing the truth and learning how it affects your present.
How did white people become white people? I'm so glad you asked. I find that most white people have no idea how they came to identify as white. And because they don't know that history, they often fundamentally misunderstand the push against whiteness and white supremacy. You see, white people didn't exist before the middle of the 17th century, as in the middle of the 1600s. And if your mind immediately went to the year 1619, then you're on to something. More on that later. And this isn't to say that lighter-skinned people didn't exist. Of course they did. Europe is a real place with real people. But those people didn't identify as white people. They were Englishmen, Dutch, Germanic, Slavs, Greeks, Gauls, Scythians. Princeton history professor Dr. Nell Irvin Painter chronicles the invention of this diasporic pan-European white identity in her book, The History of White People. She demonstrates how white identity was constructed primarily as a justification for the enslavement of African people. Whiteness was from the very beginning constructed to be the antithesis of blackness. Enslavers needed some moral and philosophical cover for what they were doing to African people. And so the myth of whiteness, moral purity, superiority, ruling destiny was born. And as such, whiteness is and always has been a political identity, a fraternal order, a loyalty rewards program that depends entirely on all of its members agreeing to maintain the myth. And even though this myth has been thoroughly debunked, many are working overtime to this very day to maintain its power.
Now, the insights shared by these individuals are a crucial reminder of the complex and often overlooked history of race and identity in America. The Irish experience, in particular, highlights how palm-coloredness has been constructed and perpetuated over time. As noted, the Irish were not initially considered palm color in the United States, facing discrimination and indentured servitude. Now, this was rooted in ethnic, classist, and religious prejudices as well as xenophobia. However, as the Irish assimilated into American culture, they eventually became accepted as palm color and gained access to the privileges afforded by palm color supremacy. Now, this phenomenon is supported by empirical evidence. Historian Noel Ignatiev's work, How the Irish Became Palm Color, details how the Irish were systematically racialized as non-palm color in the 19th century, but later became palm color through a process of cultural and political assimilation. Moreover, the discrimination between chattel slavery and indentured servitude is crucial. While both systems were oppressive, chattel slavery was a uniquely racialized institution that enslaved Africans and their descendants as property, perpetuating intergenerational trauma and oppression. Now, the law in Virginia mentioned earlier exemplifies this racialized context. This law ensured that enslaved African women's children were born into slavery, perpetuating the institution. In contrast, indentured servitude, while exploitative, was not necessarily racialized and did not perpetuate intergenerational oppression. Now, these nuances are essential in understanding America's complex history of race and oppression. Now, the Irish experience serves as a poignant example of how palm-coloredness has been constructed and perpetuated. Initially facing discrimination and indentured servitude, the Irish were eventually assimilated into palm-coloredness, gaining access to privileges denied to others. Now, this highlights the malleability of palm-coloredness and its use as a tool of social control. As historian Neil Penter notes, palm-coloredness is not a fixed or natural category, but a fluid and contested one. Moreover, the distinction between chattel slavery and indentured servitude is crucial in understanding the uniquely racialized nature of slavery in America. While both systems were oppressive, only slavery was perpetuated through intergenerational trauma and oppression with lasting impacts on Black Americans. Now, Irish and African Americans had lots in common and lots of contact. They lived side by side and shared workspaces. In the early years of immigration, the poor Irish and Blacks were thrown together, very much part of the same class competing for the same jobs. Now, in the census of 1850, the term mulatto appears for the first time due primarily to intermarriage between Irish and African Americans. Now, the Irish were often referred to as the racial slayer, turned inside out, and racial slayer as smoked Irish. A famous quip of the time attributed to a Black man went something like this: "My master is a great tyrant. He treats me like a common Irishman." Free Blacks and Irish were viewed by the nativists as related, somehow similar, performing the same tasks in society. Now, it was felt that if amalgamation between the races was to happen, it would happen between Irish and Blacks. But ultimately, the Irish made the decision to embrace palm-coloredness, thus becoming part of the system which dominated and oppressed Black people. Now, although it contradicted their experience back home, it meant freedom here since Blackness meant slavery. We can go on and on, but I want you, my viewers, to share your thoughts, your contributions in the comment section. What are your views on these videos? Share your thoughts in the comment section and let's have a conversation. Thank you for always watching and see you in my next video.